Helmer, who I do not believe needs any introduction from me. Roger, it's all yours.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. I love it when people clap at the beginning because I'm never quite sure they're going to clap at the end. But that's very reassuring. Can I thank you all, thank your chairman, and thank you all for inviting me tonight and for an excellent dinner. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Great to be here. For those of you who don't know, I've been a member of the European Parliament, so help me, for 14 years now. And I was actually elected 3 times as a Conservative. So I apologise for that. I came across to join UKIP March of last year at the spring conference in Skegness. And my only regret since I've come across to join UKIP is that I didn't do it years before. But it is just extraordinary how things have gone since then. By the way, before I get into anything else, can I say I brought some bits and pieces. I brought my contact details. I do a regular monthly electronic newsletter from Brussels. Anybody wants that, just send me an email and ask for it. And tonight I'm told I'm going to be speaking about energy. So I brought a few copies of the UKIP energy policy booklet, but if there aren't enough to go around, it's available on the web. You can readily Google it. I never thought when I joined UKIP in March of last year that we would be where we are today. And even going into those most recent elections, the local council elections, I thought we'd do well. I was very confident. I've been out canvassing, I knocked on doors, as I'm sure all you have, and I was very pleased at the response. I never remember, as a member of the Conservative Party, getting that sort of positive response on the doorstep. But even so, I was stunned by the outcome. Where were we? About 25% share of the vote. There were 3 big parties in that election. There were us, there was Labour, there was the Conservatives. Oh, and by the way, there was also those Lib Dem chaps somewhere down around near the bottom. And as for the Greens, God knows what happened to them, but they didn't go very far. It is just an astonishing result. I think we have to accept that some people who voted for UKIP voted for us because they're just sick to death of the old parties and the old politicians who tell them one story and then go and do something else. But I think an awful lot of those voters, excuse me, my voice is a bit off, an awful lot of those voters voted for us because we have a story to tell, because they are concerned about Europe, because they're concerned about immigration. Many of them are concerned about wind farms. They are concerned about a whole range of issues. So they didn't just vote negatively, none of the above. They voted positively for the sort of policies that we are bringing forward. And as Peter rightly said, we were regarded at one time as a one-trick pony. We were a party with only one policy: to get out of the European Union. Now we are seen as a party with something to say on the key issues that really matter to voters on the doorstep. Yes, of course, Europe, but these other policies as well. Now, I've been listening to a chap called Ed Miliband, and he gave a speech over the weekend. Did you hear his speech over the weekend? He said, we don't want to have, the Labour Party doesn't want to have a referendum on Europe. Europe isn't that important to the voters. The voters are concerned about jobs and stability and the cost of living. Jobs and stability and the cost of living. I wonder if Mr. Miliband has been recently to Spain or Italy or Greece. Do you know what the youth unemployment rate in Greece is? It is 64%. That means that of young people in Greece between the ages of 16 and 25, 2 out of 3 are out of work, and many of them have been out of work for a very long time, and frankly they are starting to despair. There was another story today from Spain where a very senior churchman, the bishop of, I forget which city, but a major city in Spain, has actually, sorry?
It was the Catholic prelate.
Yeah, you're right, it was the cardinal or bishop or whoever of one of the dioceses in Spain, came out and said if we go on like this there will be serious social unrest. If that is Ed Miliband's idea of stability and prosperity and jobs, then it is a very strange idea. And the point is this: yes, of course people are concerned about jobs and prosperity and the cost of living, but Europe affects all those things. So it's no good saying we care about these things but we don't care about Europe. It's a bit like a motorist saying, I'm very worried about wet roads but I don't care about the rain. You know, it is the rain that's causing the wet roads. It is Europe that is causing many of the problems, not all, let's be fair, but many of the problems that we face today. And I'll give you one example, because I'm here to talk about energy. Have you looked at your electricity bills and your power bills recently? Have you noticed what's happened to them? They are going up and up and up. Now, it isn't true to say that the whole of that is the result of Brussels policy. But it is true to say that a good half of it is the result of Brussels policy. They have a thing they call the 2009 Climate and Energy Package. And it is that package which has set absurd targets for renewable energy. Why do they do that? They do it because they're worried about the threat of climate change. So they want to reduce CO2 emissions. Even in their own terms, it's a daft policy. If you want to reduce CO2 emissions, you can actually build nuclear power stations. The French get, 75% of their electricity generation from nuclear power stations, no CO2 emissions. But instead, they take these, what I call playground technologies, with their wind farms and their photovoltaic cells, and they give massive, eye-watering subsidies. Now, it's a very important day today for another reason. Have you heard the news? That chap, Chris Huhne, remember Chris Huhne? He got out of jail today. He had an 8-month sentence. He served 62 days and he got out. I dare say there are quite a lot of people in jail today who would like to work or like to serve a quarter of their sentence and get out. But anyway, he served a quarter of his sentence and he got out. He served 2 months for lying about swapping his speeding points with his wife. 2 months. I think that's pretty fair, 2 months. But he should have a life sentence for the damage which he has done to energy policy in this country. Because it was on his watch that we put through the Climate Change Act. It was on his watch that we've been building all these wind farms, covering the country with them in defiance of the opinion of local people. You know, this coalition government loves to talk about localism. It loves to talk about passing decisions down to local people so they can have control over their environment. And what happens then? Your local council listens to a planning application for a wind farm and it turns it down. Wonderful. Everybody celebrates, opens the champagne. What does the developer do? He goes to appeal. Somebody comes down from Whitehall, an inspector, and spends a few days listening to the arguments on both sides, and then he says at the end of it, well, we understand there are some local objections, but the priority, the national priority of reducing CO2 emissions means that we must go ahead with this. And this has happened again and again and again. And by the way, it happened to the wind farm, which is now within a mile of my home in Leicestershire. And I am sick of it, and I quite understand the voters are sick of it. And quite a lot of people are voting for UKIP because they think we're saying sensible things about wind farms. Now, I published this booklet on behalf of the party at our last conference, October of last year. Keeping the lights on. Rolling blackouts by 2020, I said. I thought maybe I was being alarmist. I thought maybe people would come along and say, get realistic, Roger, there are not going to be any blackouts by 2020. Well, since then, in fact, it was only a few weeks after we launched that book, Ofgem, who are the people who ought to know about these things, they came along and said, maybe we're going to have blackouts by 2017. I saw a very interesting report from an investment bank in London. Don't know them terribly well, Liberum is the name, but the stuff is on the web. Their analysts had looked at the energy market. They concluded that renewables simply cannot deliver, and the result of that is they are anticipating a serious generating capacity crunch by as early as 2015. And they made an interesting point. They said, when that happens, there'll be 3 stakeholders. They like modern trendy words, don't they? 3 stakeholders who will be affected. The first is the government. Voters hate it when the lights go out. The second is electricity consumers. And the third is the investors who've been roped in to invest in all these green energy projects. And as they say, the government will have a strong incentive to protect itself and to an extent protect electricity consumers, who are after all voters. And so the guys left carrying the can will be the investors. And the advice from this investment bank, therefore, was think very carefully before you invest in renewable energy projects. Now, where do we stand as a party on these issues? the starting point for energy policy and the disastrous energy policy we have at the moment, the starting point is climate change. The climate is changing disastrously as a result of human emissions of CO2, they tell us. However, if you actually look at the history of climate, whether you choose to look over very long time periods or shorter time periods, like say the last 10,000 years, what you find is that climate changes all the time. Over the last 10,000 years, there has been a pretty steady cyclical change of climate that has taken about 1,000-year cycles. So if you go back far enough, in the Roman period 2,000 years ago, it was warm. They were growing grapes up near Hadrian's Wall. Then there were the Dark Ages, which were cold. Then we had the medieval warm period about 1,000 years ago, when, guess what, it was warm. And that was the time when the Vikings got to Greenland and actually founded a colony in Greenland and farmed there and grew crops there and kept animals there. You wouldn't do very well doing that today. So then there was the Little Ice Age, you know, when the Thames was frozen over, and they actually had ice fairs on the frozen Thames in the winter, long cold winters. And then in the last couple of hundred years, gradually, slowly, it has become a little warmer. That is a pattern that has been repeated over and over and over again for the last 10,000 years. In the last 100 years, average global temperatures have increased by 0.7 degrees. 0.7 degrees centigrade. That's not a disputed figure. If you go and ask the IPCC, they'll tell you the same. This is not something I kind of made up in the car on the way here. That is the accepted figure by climatologists and meteorologists. Mean global temperatures have increased by 0.7 degrees in the last 100 years. Yet when I write to the European Commission saying, why do you think there is a serious problem? Don't you know that there have been cyclical changes before? They write back and say, there have been cyclical changes. But recent changes have been so very rapid that we have to believe it's the result of human activity. Well, if 0.7 degrees in 100 years is very rapid, I'm a Dutchman. The first thing to understand is that climate is cyclical. We've seen it all before. Okay, are the glaciers melting? Yes, they are, a little bit. And they melted 1,000 years ago, and they melted 2,000 years ago, and you can see perfectly well in the geological record that as the climate goes through this cyclical process, glaciers tend to advance a little bit and retreat a little bit. That is what they do. There is nothing there to be excited about or worried about. The other thing that's important to know is that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. There's no question about that, not in my mind anyway. I've heard one or two people arguing, but in my view, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. But the physics equation that governs the greenhouse effect of the gas, it gets a bit sort of complicated, but it is a law of diminishing returns. The higher the level gets, the flatter the curve gets. We're up most of the curve already, so the further increases will have a very small effect. CO2 affects the climate, but other things affect it much more. Water vapor, for example, and not a lot of people know this, water vapor is a more important greenhouse gas than CO2. And obviously there is nothing whatever we can do about water vapor. As long as the breeze blows over the ocean, there's no way we can seek to control water vapor. The other thing, of course, is the biggest influence on the temperature of the Earth is the sun. And the sun's radiation does vary. And what's more, the Earth's cloud cover and reflectivity also vary over time. And many people who study these issues, quite serious qualified people who are climatologists and who are meteorologists and so on, believe that the interaction between cosmic rays, clouds, and solar radiation is actually a much more important factor than CO2. So we don't have a major problem, and as you'll probably be aware, even the Met Office has now admitted that it's about 17 years since we saw any global warming. You know, global warming is an urgent problem, we're approaching a tipping point, the world's going to be a disaster, everybody's going to die. But for 17 years there hasn't been any global warming. And they can't explain that. We saw that in the ClimateGate emails, you know, from the University of East Anglia. These guys who've been promoting climate alarmism are sending each other emails saying, what's gone wrong? We knew the world was going to get warmer, and now it isn't. What's the explanation? And they don't know what the explanation is. And the explanation is they've been looking at the wrong issue. They've been looking at CO2 as though it was the only thing that mattered. It is merely a minor factor amongst many factors that affects the climate. So anything we do to eliminate climate change, mitigate climate change, in my view, and in the view of many of us in UKIP, is intrinsically a waste of time because we're addressing the wrong problem. But let's, for a moment, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And let's say, okay, well, some of these guys and the BBC and the IPCC are saying that CO2 is the big issue. So what should we do about it? We've put up a lot of wind turbines. Now, we all know the problem with wind turbines. They're ugly. Local people don't like them. When the wind drops, they don't produce anything. When the wind blows too hard, they don't produce anything. And people get massive subsidies. What is it? David Cameron's father-in-law gets £300,000 a day, I think, from his wind turbines on it. They're ridiculous sums of money these people are making. Sorry, I don't think it's a day, but it's a big figure. Wind power does not, in fact, deliver either extra electricity to the grid or reductions in emissions. This gets slightly complicated, but please bear with me because it's important. The thing about wind farms is they're intermittent. Okay? Sometimes they're producing some power, other times they're not. So you have to have conventional backup, normally gas-fired power stations. And they have to be instantly available so that when the wind goes up, they can go down, and when the wind goes down, they can go up. That's the only way you can deliver continuous power supply which you need to run a modern economy. But as we all know, with any of these big industries like electricity generating plants, of course they run most efficiently when they run more or less continuously. If you take a gas-fired power station and you run it like that, constantly ramping it up, constantly running it down again, keeping it on what they call spinning reserve when it's not delivering anything, that is a very inefficient way of running a gas-fired power station. So you are actually producing more emissions and burning more fuel for each unit of power you get out of that gas-fired power station because you're running it intermittently than you would if you ran it properly. So it's no good just looking at the wind farm and saying we get X amount of electricity from it. You've got to look at the system of wind farms plus backup, and you must look at the total emissions from the system. And what you find is, from those inefficiently run gas-fired plants, you are producing nearly the emissions that you would have produced if you just run the gas and forgotten about the wind. The other thing is, are there any accountants in the room? Good, we got an accountant. If you were looking over a proposal to a bank manager, and one guy comes in and says, I'm going to build a gas-fired power station and it's going to cost me £3 billion and I'm going to run it at 95% capacity, and you get another guy comes in and says, I'm going to build a gas-fired power station, it's going to cost £3 billion and I'm going to run it at 41% of capacity because it's balancing out the wind, which of those are you going to lend to? It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Yeah, and you know, the European Commission, they're smart guys, they understand this stuff. They have realized that this is a problem and that nobody is going to invest in gas-fired power stations to be backup for wind. So what do they come up with? It's an idea called capacity payments. So we're going to go to these operators and say, we know you're losing money because you're only running your plant for 40% of the time, but we will give you a subsidy to make it worth your while. So not only are we subsidizing the wind farms and paying money to landowners and developers and all these guys, we're actually going to be paying subsidies to the guys who are producing the backup. The result is we're going to have the same emissions and the same fuel consumption and the same amount of electricity coming out, but we're going to pay twice as much for it. That is the plan. So even in their own terms, it just doesn't work. The other thing you've probably heard about is green jobs. You know, we're told we've got to have all these exciting, whizzy new renewable energy things because of all the green jobs they're going to create, and we're going to be world leaders in this thing, and we're going to make loads and loads of money. We forget, of course, that most of the components of photovoltaic cells are actually coming out of China, so to the extent that we're creating green jobs, we're creating them in Shanghai, which you may not feel is a very useful way of doing these things. But actually, there have been a series of academic studies, which are quoted in there, academic studies that show that the total effect of the renewable energy business and the green jobs, okay, you create a few jobs in the wind farm business or in the solar PV business, but because you force up the cost of energy, you slow growth overall, and therefore you reduce employment in the rest of the economy. And all the estimates that I've seen from different academic studies shows that every one green job costs 2 or 3 or 4, several jobs in the real economy. So don't be taken in by the green job story. Now, okay, so even if we want to reduce CO2 emissions, wind farms are not a good way of doing it. Much the same arguments, by the way, apply to solar photovoltaic. But let's consider what we in Europe are doing compared to the rest of the world. America, as you probably read, has had this unconventional gas revolution. Do you know the cost of gas for industrial purposes in America is about 1/3 of the cost of similar gas here in Europe, and a quarter of the cost of gas in Japan, but Japan's a bit of a special case. They got cheap gas. People are moving investment and industry to America, and indeed, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, America was worried about outsourcing, all the jobs going to China. Now we've got cheap energy in America, we've got wages going up in China, they're talking about insourcing, they're bringing those jobs back again, they're talking about a manufacturing renaissance in America based on cheap energy. Meantime, we in Europe are giving ourselves just about the most expensive energy in the world, leaving aside Japan, which, as I say, is a special case. The result of that is nobody wants to invest in Europe. What we are doing is we are exporting industries and investment and jobs, mostly to other jurisdictions with lower environmental standards. Apparently a ton of steel made in China produces twice the CO2 emissions of a ton of steel made in Europe. So the result of our policy is we are costing ourselves investment and jobs, and we are increasing global emissions. What is the sense of that? It is absolute madness. And it's not just industry, of course, that pays for energy, it's households, it's pensioners. The number of households in this country, and they are mostly pensioners, the number of households in fuel poverty has gone up by about 1 million in the last couple of years, and that is largely the result of British government policy and Brussels European policy. That is what is going on. And finally, if you're really concerned about reducing CO2 emissions, remember that Britain is about 2% of global emissions. So let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine that we said, right, we're so worried about CO2, we're going to close down the whole of the British economy, no manufacturing, no electric light, no motor cars, nothing. We're all going to go back to living on, 1 acre and a cow. That's all we're going to do. China would make up what we had, the difference of what we had left off, the 2% that we had prevented. They would make up by their growth in 1 year. So the idea that we can make a dramatic difference to global emissions, whatever we do in this country, is simply absurd. What we can do is we can ruin our economy, we can crucify our bank balances, we can pauperize our children and bankrupt our grandchildren, and that's what we're setting out to do with this European and Chris Huhn policy. It is absolutely a disaster. So you say, what about the rest of the world? Why don't they join in? Well, they talk about it, they make nice noises about it. The number of Greens who said to me, oh, you don't understand, Roger, out in China they're getting very committed to renewable energy. What they're doing in China is they are building cheap solar PV systems and selling them to the gullible West. The amount they're actually getting of their own energy requirements from renewables is about 5% last time I checked the figures. In fact, what we are doing here, we are placing a vast bet on oil futures. When you talk to people and say, look at the cost of what we're doing with wind farms and with solar photovoltaic, they say, yeah, they say, but you're comparing it with the price of oil today. Just think in 5 years' time, the price of oil will probably be 3 times as high, and then these technologies will start looking quite competitive. And of course, we've always had this theory that, haven't we, the fossil fuels are running out, the prices are going to go up, it's going to be a disaster. Somehow those disasters never happen. Famous book by an American environmentalist called Paul Ehrlich, published in the early 1960s. He said the oil was going to run out by 1980. The population of the West was going to be starving by 1985. By 1990, the average life expectancy of an American male would be 42 years because we're poisoning ourselves with pesticides and chemicals. Well, you will have noticed that none of those predictions have come true, and just at the moment we are discovering new reserves of gas and oil at pretty much the same rate as we are consuming them. By the way, the British Geological Survey, which is in my patch, East Midlands, near Nottingham, They have produced a report on unconventional gas resources in the UK, and I'm hearing that the government is delaying the publication of that report because the government is embarrassed by how good it is and doesn't want to be dragged into lots more cheap gas. We'll see how that develops. But all around the world, other countries are giving themselves cheap energy. In China, it's coal. In India, it's coal. That's the thing. We are putting up wind farms. The Chinese are building a new coal-fired power station every week. And I understand there are about 1,200 new coal-fired power stations around the world in the pipeline. New coal-fired power stations. By the way, you may be amazed to hear that 25 of those are in Germany. So why aren't we building coal-fired power stations? I tell you why not, because there's so much pressure from the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and the trouble-making demonstrators who climb up on King's North Power Station and won't let you do anything with it. That is the problem that we have. And that is why the policy that we think is right for this country, we in UKIP, and it's set out here in this document, we think we need, first of all, more than one generating technology. We shouldn't be too reliant on any single generating technology, and we want real generating technologies that are proven and safe and deliver large amounts of electricity suitable for running a modern economy. And the way we think you should be doing that is, first of all, with coal. We don't think coal is a bad thing, we think coal is a good thing. Secondly, with gas, which is about the only thing we can build in the time frame to prevent the energy crunch. I mean, that's the thing, unfortunately, coal and nuclear take a lot longer to build. But thirdly, of course, we do need nuclear. Given that the Americans have this very cheap gas, the danger is that nuclear for some years will be more expensive than gas. But at the same time, I think we would all agree that security of supply is absolutely critical. And therefore, I wouldn't like to see a situation where we were dependent on one technology. We need, in my view, 3 technologies, and I would say they're coal, gas, and nuclear. We're starting to get this story across. We're starting to find that at least some people up in Westminster have woken up to the importance of these issues. Unfortunately, Cameron and his Lib Dem cohorts seem still to be committed to wind farms, which are not contributing at all, but I hope that they will see the sense of our arguments, and certainly the opposition which we have to wind farms is playing very well with those communities where they are actually threatened with wind farms. And as I say, I've got one next to me and I can understand why people don't like them. I hope I've demonstrated, ladies and gentlemen, that UKIP is not a single issue party. We have strong views and sound policies on a range of issues. That's the sketch of energy, and I think we're going to go and do great things with it. Thank you very much.